Welcome back to English at Work. I'm Jenny.
And I'm Alex. This is episode 4 of our English for Meetings series.
In the last 3 episodes, we've covered meeting basics, how to participate effectively, and how to lead meetings. But today's topic deserves its own episode. Virtual meetings, video calls, remote collaboration, whatever you call it, it's now a fundamental part of work life.
Even before the pandemic, virtual meetings were becoming common, but now they're absolutely essential. Many companies have fully remote teams or hybrid arrangements.
And here's the thing, virtual meetings have unique challenges that in-person meetings don't have. Technology can fail, it's harder to read body language, people get distracted more easily.
But there are also advantages if you know how to use them. You can have a meeting with people across 5 time zones. You can record discussions for people who couldn't attend. You can share screens and collaborate on documents in real time.
Today, we'll give you strategies for mastering virtual meetings, whether you're participating or leading them.
By the end of this episode, you'll know how to be just as effective on screen as you are in person. Let's get started.
Let's start by talking about why virtual meetings are fundamentally different from in-person meetings. It's not just the same thing through a screen.
Right. The medium changes the dynamics in significant ways. Let's break down the key differences.
First, the obvious one, communication challenges. What makes virtual communication harder?
You lose a lot of nonverbal information. In person, you can see someone's full body language, how they're sitting, what they're doing with their hands, subtle facial expressions.
And on video?
You see a small box with their head and shoulders. You might miss that they're leaning forward with interest or sitting back with skepticism. You definitely can't see if they're tapping their foot nervously under the table.
What about audio delay or lag?
That's a huge issue. Even a half-second delay disrupts natural conversation flow. In person, you instinctively know when someone is about to speak. On video, you might start talking at the same time and have that awkward no you go moment.
That happens constantly in virtual meetings.
It does, and it makes people hesitant to speak up because they're worried about interrupting or creating that awkward collision.
What about attention and engagement? Is that different?
Massively different. In an in-person meeting, if you pull out your phone and start scrolling, everyone sees you. There's social pressure to pay attention.
But in a virtual meeting?
You can have 10 browser tabs open, be checking email, texting, shopping online, and no one knows, unless you're called on and you have that panic moment of, sorry, what was the question?
So multitasking is a bigger temptation?
Much bigger. And it's a vicious cycle. If people aren't engaged, the meeting becomes less dynamic, which makes it even easier to tune out.
What about the fatigue factor? People talk about Zoom fatigue.
That's real. Video calls are cognitively exhausting in ways that in-person meetings aren't.
Why?
Because you're working harder to pick up on social cues. You're hyper-aware of your own face on screen. You're sitting more still than you would naturally. You're staring at a screen with unnatural eye contact. All of this requires mental energy.
So people get tired faster?
Yes. After 3 or 4 hours of back-to-back video calls, people are mentally drained. The same amount of in-person meetings would be tiring, but not as exhausting.
What about building relationships and rapport? Is that harder virtually?
Definitely. In person, you have small talk before and after meetings. You grab coffee together. You pick up on people's moods and personalities naturally.
And virtually?
You join the meeting, discuss business, and leave. There's less opportunity for those relationship-building moments unless you intentionally create them.
What about advantages of virtual meetings? Are there any?
Absolutely. Geography doesn't matter. You can include someone in Singapore and someone in New York in the same meeting. No commute time. You can go from one meeting to the next instantly. Screen sharing makes collaboration easier in some ways.
And recording?
Yes, you can record virtual meetings so people can review them later or catch up if they missed it. You can't really do that in person without it being weird.
What about for people who are shy or non-native English speakers?
Virtual can actually be easier in some ways. You can have notes in front of you without it being obvious. You can use the chat function to contribute if speaking up feels intimidating, and you don't have the physical pressure of all eyes on you.
So virtual meetings aren't inherently worse, they're just different.
Exactly. They require different strategies and skills. That's what we're going to cover today.
Let's talk about the technical foundation of successful virtual meetings. We covered some of this in the interview series, but it's worth going deeper.
Starting with platform familiarity, Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, they all work differently.
Yes, you need to know the platform cold before you lead a meeting on it. Where's the mute button? How do you share your screen? How do you enable breakout rooms?
Should you test everything before every meeting?
Before important meetings, absolutely. Join the meeting link 5 minutes early and make sure everything works. Don't discover during the meeting that your camera isn't working.
What about your physical setup? Let's talk about camera position.
Your camera should be at eye level or slightly above, not below looking up your nose, not way above looking down at the top of your head.
How do you achieve eye level?
If you're using a laptop, stack books under it or use a laptop stand. If you're using an external webcam, position it on top of your monitor at the right height.
How far should you sit from the camera?
About arm's length away. You want your head and shoulders in frame, like a professional photo. Not so close that people can see your pores, not so far that you're a tiny figure in the distance.
Now, lighting. This is critical, right?
Lighting makes a huge difference in how professional you look. The key is to have light on your face, not behind you.
What's the ideal setup?
Face a window so natural light illuminates your face. If that's not possible, use a desk lamp positioned in front of you and slightly above eye level. Or invest in a ring light. You can get decent ones for $30 to $50.
What should you avoid?
Never sit with a window behind you. You'll be a dark silhouette. Also, avoid overhead lighting only. It creates harsh shadows and makes you look tired.
What about background?
Keep it simple and professional. A plain wall is perfect. A neat bookshelf is good. An organized home office works.
What should you avoid in your background?
Messy rooms, unmade beds, laundry piles, anything distracting. Also, avoid sitting in front of a door where people might walk through behind you.
What about virtual backgrounds?
I generally recommend against them for professional meetings. They can be glitchy, your head might disappear or float weirdly. They also make it obvious you're hiding your real space.
When are virtual backgrounds acceptable?
If you truly have no other option and your real background is very unprofessional, or if company culture embraces them, but test them first. They work better on some systems than others.
Let's talk about audio. How important is good sound quality?
More important than video quality, actually. People will tolerate a slightly grainy picture, but bad audio is intolerable.
What makes for good audio?
A quiet space is number one. Close windows if you're on a busy street. Turn off fans or air conditioners if possible. Tell family or roommates you need quiet.
What about equipment?
Your computer's built-in microphone is usually fine for small meetings. For important meetings, or if you're leading, consider earbuds or a headset with a microphone.
Why is that better?
It reduces echo and picks up your voice more clearly, and you can hear others better. Just avoid big gaming headsets in professional meetings. They look too casual.
Should you always mute when you're not speaking?
In large meetings, yes. In small meetings of 3 to 5 people, you can probably stay unmuted if you're in a quiet space, but be ready to mute if background noise starts.
What about internet connection?
This is crucial. Wired Ethernet is more stable than Wi-Fi if you can manage it. If you must use Wi-Fi, sit close to the router.
What if your internet is unreliable?
Consider working from somewhere with better internet for important meetings, a friend's house, a library, a co-working space. Don't risk your career on a bad connection.
What about phone as backup?
Always have a phone number to dial in as backup. If your video fails, you can at least join by audio.
Any tips on screen sharing?
Before you share, close everything you don't want people to see. Personal emails, shopping sites, embarrassing tabs. Share just the specific window you need, not your entire screen.
Why not share your whole screen?
Because notifications will pop up. Text messages, email previews, calendar reminders. Very unprofessional.
What about bandwidth and video quality?
If multiple people in your home are on video calls or streaming, it can slow everything down. Try to schedule important meetings when you'll have the bandwidth to yourself.
Now let's talk about how to actually engage in virtual meetings, starting with the camera. Should it always be on?
Generally, yes, especially in smaller meetings. Video creates accountability and connection. It's much easier to zone out when you're just a name on a screen.
Are there times when it's okay to turn off your camera?
If you've discussed it in advance, I'm having internet issues, so I'll join audio only, that's fine. Or in very large meetings where most people have cameras off. But if you're the only one with camera off in a small meeting, it looks bad.
What about eye contact on video? This is tricky.
It is. For true eye contact, you need to look at the camera lens, not at the faces on your screen.
But that feels unnatural because you can't see people's reactions.
I know. The solution is to look at the camera when you're speaking, especially when making important points. When you're listening, you can look at the screen to see reactions.
So you alternate?
Yes, it's a skill that takes practice. Some people put a sticky note near their camera as a reminder to look there.
What about body language on video?
You need to be more expressive than in person because people can only see a small box. Nod visibly when you agree. Smile. Use hand gestures when speaking.
But not too much?
Right. Keep gestures within frame. Don't wave your arms so wildly that they disappear off screen.
What about posture?
Sit up straight but not rigidly. Lean forward slightly to show engagement. Don't slouch back in your chair. It looks disengaged, even if you're paying attention.
What about facial expressions?
Be animated. On video, flat affect looks like boredom. Show your reactions. Raise your eyebrows when surprised. Smile when pleased. Nod when agreeing.
This feels like you're performing a bit.
You are, in a way. You're compensating for the fact that video flattens everything. What feels like over-emoting to you looks normal on screen.
What about the chat function? How should you use it?
The chat is great for sharing links, clarifying points, or asking questions without interrupting. But don't have entire side conversations in the chat while the meeting is happening.
When should you use chat versus speaking up?
Use chat for quick clarifications, resource sharing, or if you're really shy. But for substantive contributions, speak up. Your voice has more impact than text.
What about the raised hand feature?
Very useful in large meetings. It signals you want to speak without interrupting. The meeting leader can then call on you.
Should you use it in small meetings?
Usually not necessary. Just wait for a pause and jump in verbally.
Let's talk about speaking up in virtual meetings. It feels harder than in person.
It is harder because of the lag and because you can't make eye contact to signal you want to speak. You need to be more assertive.
How do you jump into the conversation?
Wait for a clear pause, maybe even an extra beat longer than in person. Then jump in with your verbal signal. Can I add something here? Or I'd like to build on that.
What if people talk over each other?
Happens all the time. If you both start talking, immediately stop and say, "Sorry, go ahead." Usually the other person does the same, then one of you commits to going.
How do you avoid that?
As a participant, look for longer pauses. As a leader, actively call on people. "Sarah, you look like you want to say something," or "Let's hear from people who haven't spoken yet."
What about showing active listening on video?
This is so important because people can't see your full body language. You need to work harder to show you're engaged.
How?
Nod frequently when people are speaking. Use verbal affirmations. Yes, I see. Make facial expressions that show you're processing. Occasionally, jot down notes where people can see you doing it.
What about looking at your own video? Is that a problem?
It's very tempting, but try to resist. You'll seem vain or distracted. Most platforms let you hide self-view. Use that feature.
What if you need to step away briefly during a meeting?
If it's urgent, turn off your camera and mute, then use the chat to say, "Sorry, need to step away for 2 minutes." Make it quick.
Is that better than just staying on camera but not paying attention?
Much better. At least you're being transparent. Don't sit there obviously not paying attention while pretending to be present.
Now let's talk about the specific problems that come up in virtual meetings and how to handle them.
Starting with the most common, audio problems. What do you do when you can't hear someone?
Speak up immediately. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Could you speak up or check your microphone? Don't let the whole meeting go by with bad audio.
What if it's your audio that's the problem?
If people say they can't hear you, check your mute button first. That's usually the culprit. Then check your microphone settings. If it doesn't resolve quickly, offer to dial in by phone.
What about echo or feedback?
This usually happens when someone isn't using headphones and their microphone picks up sound from their speakers. The solution is for everyone to mute when not speaking, or for that person to use headphones.
What if your internet connection drops mid-meeting?
Rejoin as quickly as possible. When you're back, briefly acknowledge it. Sorry, my connection dropped. Could someone catch me up on what I missed? Don't make a huge deal of it.
What if it keeps dropping repeatedly?
Switch to audio only to save bandwidth, or reschedule if you're leading the meeting. Don't struggle through with constant interruptions.
Let's talk about background noise. Dogs barking, construction, doorbells.
Life happens. If it's brief, just mute until it passes. If it's ongoing, acknowledge it. I apologize for the background noise. There's construction outside. I'll stay on mute unless I'm speaking.
What about children or family members interrupting?
Handle it briefly and professionally. Excuse me one moment. Deal with the interruption off camera if possible. When you return, sorry about that. Where were we?
Should you apologize profusely?
One brief apology is enough. Don't dwell on it. Everyone understands that we're working from home.
What about technical failures when you're presenting or screen sharing?
Have a backup plan. If screen share fails, can you email the document? Can someone else share from their computer? Don't let technical issues derail the entire meeting.
What about Zoom fatigue that we mentioned earlier?
As a leader, you can combat this. Schedule shorter meetings, 25 minutes instead of 30, 50 instead of 60. Give people breaks in long meetings. Don't schedule back-to-back video calls all day.
What about as a participant?
Take breaks between meetings. Stand up, move around, look away from the screen. Don't eat lunch at your desk while on a video call. Give your brain rest.
What about engagement when people seem checked out?
As a leader, you need to actively engage people. Call on quiet participants. Use polls or interactive features. Break into smaller groups. Don't just lecture at cameras for an hour.
What if you're a participant and you notice yourself zoning out?
Take notes. Ask questions. Turn on your camera if it's off. That creates accountability. Stand up if you can. Standing meetings can increase engagement.
What about time zones when you have a global team?
This is tough. Try to rotate meeting times so the burden isn't always on the same people. If it's 6 a.m. for someone, acknowledge it. I know it's early for our Asia team. Thanks for joining.
Should you record meetings?
It's helpful for people who can't attend, but always ask permission first. I'd like to record this for people who couldn't make it. Any objections?
Why ask permission?
Some people are uncomfortable being recorded. Some companies have policies against it. In some places, it's illegally required to get consent.
What about distractions in your environment? How do you minimize them?
Close all other programs and tabs. Put your phone on silent and out of sight. Use a Do Not Disturb sign on your door. Treat the virtual meeting like you would an in-person meeting.
What about when other people seem distracted?
As a leader, you can call them back. Mark, what are your thoughts on this? Usually being called on once makes people pay attention for the rest of the meeting.
What if you accidentally share the wrong screen or show something embarrassing?
Stop sharing immediately and move on quickly. Oops, wrong window. Here's what I meant to share. Don't dwell on the mistake.
Let's talk about something that's easy in person but hard virtually, building relationships and rapport.
This is one of the biggest challenges of remote work. How do you create genuine connections through a screen?
What are strategies for this?
First, build in time for small talk. Don't just join the meeting and immediately dive into business. The first 2 to 3 minutes, chat casually like you would in person.
What do you talk about?
Weekend plans, weather, something you noticed in their background. Is that a guitar behind you? Do you play? These little personal touches matter.
But you don't want to waste meeting time?
It's not wasted. Those few minutes build relationships that make collaboration easier. People work better with people they like and know.
What about virtual coffee chats or social meetings?
Very valuable. Schedule 15-minute virtual coffees with colleagues just to chat, no agenda.
Or have team meetings where the first 10 minutes are purely social.
Does that actually feel natural?
It can. Play a quick game, do a show and tell where everyone shares something from their desk. Ask a fun question. If you could have dinner with anyone, living or dead, who would it be?
What about reading people's emotions remotely?
It's harder, but still possible. Pay attention to facial expressions, tone of voice, energy level. If someone seems off, you can ask, "You seem quiet today. Everything okay?" Acknowledge challenges explicitly. I know it's hard being stuck at home with kids doing remote school. We appreciate everyone's flexibility. Verbal empathy matters when you can't physically pat someone on the shoulder.
What about celebrating wins remotely?
Make it visible and vocal. Let's take a moment to celebrate. Sarah just closed the biggest deal of the quarter. You can use reactions, clapping emojis, thumbs up. Some teams do virtual happy hours.
What about onboarding new people in a virtual environment?
Extra challenging. Schedule more frequent check-ins. Assign them a buddy. Make introductions explicit. Don't assume they'll figure out who everyone is.
What about informal learning that happens in offices?
You mean like overhearing a conversation and learning something? That's lost in virtual work. You need to be more intentional about knowledge sharing.
How?
Regular knowledge sharing sessions, documenting processes, creating more opportunities for questions. Don't assume people will just pick things up.
What's the biggest mindset shift needed for virtual meetings?
You have to work harder at everything. Connection doesn't happen automatically. Engagement takes effort. Communication requires more clarity. But it's absolutely doable if you're intentional.
Let's recap virtual meeting mastery.
Virtual meetings are fundamentally different from in-person. You lose nonverbal cues, face audio lag, deal with distractions, and experience more fatigue. But they also offer advantages like geographic flexibility and easier collaboration tools.
Technical setup is crucial. Camera at eye level, good lighting on your face, clean background, quality audio, and stable internet. Test everything before important meetings.
Engage more expressively on video. Look at the camera when speaking. Use animated facial expressions and gestures. Nod to show active listening, and use chat appropriately.
Handle common challenges, audio problems, connection drops, background noise, technical failures. Have backup plans and don't let tech derail the meeting.
Combat Zoom fatigue. Schedule shorter meetings. Take breaks. Don't book back-to-back calls all day. Build in time for small talk and relationship building.
Work harder to create connection. Small talk at the beginning, virtual coffee chats, acknowledging emotions, celebrating wins visibly.
Next episode, we're covering presentations in meetings, how to deliver compelling presentations, whether in person or virtual.
Until then, this is Alex.
And Jenny from English at Work. Test your setup, turn on that camera, and show up fully present. See you next time.